So the president of Korea vetoed what is known as the revision to the Grain Management Act. And this was a widely expected thing. For those who are outside Korea, this sounds like a very dry, maybe boring policy dispute that the president decided to veto in terms of legislation that was passed by the National Assembly, which is controlled by the opposition party. But the interesting part of this story actually comes later when one of his political supporters came out in a media interview and said some very interesting things that led to a big political fallout. We'll get to that part later, but to give you some background on what this bill entails, it's known as the revision to the Grain Management Act. And so in Korean, it would be called the 양곡 관리법 개정안. And essentially, the president exercised his presidential privilege in terms of exercising his veto power. He has signaled that he is against this bill, and it's really no surprise that he did indeed veto the legislation. The actual bill itself, what it entails is rice farming is a big political issue here in Korea. There are many rice farmers that struggle to stay competitive in today's environment because of imports of cheaper rice from overseas. And there's been a surplus of rice production here in Korea, which has brought a downward pressure to the rice sales in the country, along with some of the changes in Korean society and culture where, quite frankly, people are just eating less and less rice as the generations pass. And so that was a dilemma. What do you do? How do you help these rice farmers out who are struggling? What can you do with this free market economy where the demand doesn't meet the supply? Well, the revision to this Grain Management Act would have addressed at least the concerns about the well-being of the farmers. It would mandate that the government would purchase surplus supply of rice if that production went beyond 3 to 5% of what was national demand, or if the prices of rice, the market price of rice, fell by 5 to 8% compared to the previous year. Basically, it was a market intervention to make sure that rice prices would be propped up at a level that would be sustainable for these rice farmers' livelihoods. Now, this was, again, a political issue, and it really kind of falls along the familiar conservative liberal lines in terms of how you approach economic policy. And there are good faith arguments on both sides of this. The conservative argument would be the government should not intervene in the free markets and that the rice farmers have to be more competitive in this modern day and age. And if they're not able to do so, it's not up to the government to spend taxpayer money to purchase this surplus. It is a populist policy, and they claim it really does no benefit to the rice farmers. Now, the other side of the argument is that rice farming is an inherent treasured aspect of Korean society and culture. It's been a part of the Korean fabric for thousands of years, and that the government does have a responsibility, a role to play in making sure that these rice farmers survive. And what they've been calling for is, well, if you guys don't like this revision to the Grain Management Act, and if the president, again, which is within his right as the executive of the leader of this country, he can veto this legislation, but he's got to also, or the ruling party, has to also offer an alternative. What are you going to do to help these rice farmers? How are you going to make sure that the domestic rice industry stays afloat. And that's where we get to the controversy that ensued after the president decided to veto the legislation. The question was asked to one of the leaders of the party, Cho Soo-jin, who is a Supreme Council member of the ruling People Power Party. And she was asked, what are you guys going to do? What's the alternative? She came out on a KBS radio interview, and she said, well, I'm going to give you guys a scoop. This is something that we've been working on, and this is our alternative proposal to make sure that we can prop up the rice industry without this socialistic meddling in the free markets. What we are going to do is make sure that people eat more rice. And we can start some campaigns to talk about how rice is awesome, get people to finish their bowls of rice. There seemed to be an emphasis also, controversially, on women, saying that now Cho Soo-jin, obviously being a woman herself, she said, women these days, they're all trying to diet, trying to look good, get slim. They're not finishing their bowls of rice. And so we should try to get them to finish that bowl of rice. Now, as you can imagine, that wasn't necessarily taken kindly by a majority of the population, and this was maybe deemed questionable as to whether this was even something that could be considered a viable alternative to what was proposed, which was the revision to the Grain Management Act. And so the inevitable backlash ensued, including from the former chairman of the party, again, conservative politician Lee Jun-suk, but a reformist politician. He posted on Facebook essentially saying, okay, so you guys, the party, the president, you're opposed to the revision of the Grain Management Act. What is your solution to that? Your alternative proposal? You get the girls who are dieting, so they're not eating rice. So make sure that they finish up their bowl of rice. Let's get some campaigns on that. People don't know that rice is lower in calories than other foods. That's going to be the good solution to all of this. And his point was, is that really going to be considered a reasonable alternative to what's going on right now? And he's essentially saying that you're just digging yourself a hole and you're creating a mountain that you're not going to be able to climb out on. He subsequently put up another post where, using logic and I would say a bit of trolling as well, he talked about, okay, Cho Soo-jin, you can propose this idea that you should finish up a bowl of rice, and that's going to solve all the inherent problems in the rice industry, especially for the domestic farmers. However, if you just look at the history of how people are consuming rice, and he gave the example of 제육볶음, which is that spicy pork stewed meat that you can have rice with, and he was talking about, practically speaking, even if you finish or you tell everybody or you force everybody to finish up a bowl of rice, these bowls of rice have been getting smaller and smaller as the years progressed. And he put up some photos of how a typical rice bowl in 1940 was around 680 millimeters, went down to 670 in 1950, then further 560 in the 60s and 70s, all the way up through the 2000s, 2013, where that same bowl of rice now is only 190 milliliters in capacity compared to back in 1940, which when it was the average 680. So it kind of highlights two things. It highlights that there is just this natural change in consumption patterns and dietary habits of Koreans, and it's just the evolution of how Koreans consume food. People are just eating less rice. There's a host of different reasons for that. Some are turning to bread as alternatives. Just like globally, there is this idea that excessive consumption of carbohydrates is not necessarily a good thing. And so we've seen a general reduction in rice consumption. But he also was essentially trolling what Cho Soo-jin, and it does look like now this was actually some kind of policy that the 국민의힘 party was trying to propose as a counter to the revision to the Grain Management Act, saying that, look, this is not going to solve me. You can tell everyone to eat their rice, but that rice is going to be served and purchased by the restaurant. So we're talking about the distributors and the suppliers. And when you serve a bowl of rice that used to be 680 millimeters to now 190, it's not really going to put a huge dent in the overall rice consumption. And the ultimate goal, if everyone agrees that there's got to be some way to help these rice farmers, it's not going to help them as well. And so there was a lot of criticism, including from other prominent political figures. The former justice minister of the previous administration, Chumie, came out and was talking about that one comment that kind of rubbed women the wrong way, saying that women need to finish up that bowl of rice. Well, why don't we do something else? We have a lot of people in the presidential staff, the ministers, including and especially maybe the president himself, who love to drink. Why don't you all start drinking a lot of sal makgeolli, which is this rice wine that is a traditional liquor here in Korea? Why don't you drink a lot of that? And maybe that could be a better counter proposal to this. So it was a head scratcher. Now, there are real policy disputes. And again, there are good faith arguments both ways as to why the president may want to veto this bill, why the conservative ruling party may be opposed to the revision of this Grain Management Act. But you got to offer counter proposals. And if the counter proposal is finish up your bowl of rice, especially you women who are vain and trying to lose weight, stop doing that and just finish up that bowl of rice, it's not going to be necessarily taken seriously among the wider public as a real alternative to all of this. And it's probably coincidental, but this president has gone under fire for being perhaps a little bit too pro-Japanese in his leanings. And just so happened that coincidentally, a report coming out, and this is, we should note, from Joseonilbo, a conservative, the preeminent conservative media organization here in Korea, where they also talked about this proposal, but also noted that Japan has just a little earlier done something similar themselves. They've been trying to undergo some kind of promotional campaign about eating rice to prop up their own rice industry. Again, rice farmers in these East Asian countries, it is a big political issue because there is this idea that national food security is one thing, the pride, the national traditional reliance on rice as a staple is something that people still feel needs to be held sacred and needs to survive. And so Japan feels likewise, and they are also apparently doing a similar campaign of trying to encourage rice consumption, similar to what Cho Soo-jin had proposed. So everyone had their fun, maybe crack some jokes at Cho Soo-jin's expense. Maybe Cho Soo-jin would offer a mea culpa saying, oh, I might have misspoke. Maybe this was something that got misconstrued, but look, I'm going to try to offer something better and I'll do better next time. No. And what has been sort of the hallmark of the current administration and the ruling party is that you never admit to wrongdoing and you double down on what you said, no matter how controversial it is. She essentially basically said, I had sincere intentions of this rollout to the counter proposal that was misconstrued. The framing of this was malicious and it was undergone with very, very malintent. and therefore I am upset about this. Now, to be fair, there does seem to be some kind of official rollout of this so-called 민생 119 committee that the ruling party is trying to launch. And it does involve propping up the rice industry through various means, like promoting alternative rice products, rice crackers, rice cakes, and trying to make that more popular so that people will consume more rice and therefore domestic rice farmers can sell more of it. She just happened to, in that KBS interview, talk about finishing up a bowl of rice and talking about women and how they need to diet, or they want to diet, and they are intentionally not finishing up their bowls of rice and perhaps disparaging them for not doing so and encouraging that they should, because rice is low calorie, according to her. And so she's upset about it. It does feel like no expressions of regret or apologies are forthcoming, but it was an interesting sort of political drama or theater that arose from, once again, a very serious and disputed policy that will have some pretty far-reaching effects on the Korean economy going forward, especially for the domestic rice industry, which, again, is going to be something that cannot be ignored by any of these politicians going forward. But I think this chapter will mostly be remembered for the finish up your bowl of rice statement uttered by Cho Soo-jin. All right, hope you enjoyed this one. Leave a like, subscribe. We'll talk to you in the next one. Until then, goodbye.